So, as I've been talking about recently, I have been working on an over-encompassing episode on The Mummy as a franchise and looking through each of the various series and movies that has come to represent The Mummy. As I've continued to work through the whole project, I've realized just how incredibly large this episode would be, and the amount of research I'm doing and time to watch the movies and edit everything and come up with my analysis has proven to make this episode a little too long. And so instead, we're going to be breaking it up into a couple of parts. In this first part, we're going to be looking at the Universal series that includes the 1932 The Mummy through the last movie, Abbott and Costello, in 1955. And then in the second series, we'll be looking at the next series. And I think this should be about a 3-part series on The Mummy as a franchise. And so I hope you enjoy this episode, and I hope you enjoy the next 2 parts. First up, as I said, we're looking at the Universal Classic Monsters series, which spawned 6 Mummy movies between 1932 and 1955. These films, while sharing a central figure as the resurrected ancient Egyptian, they each exhibit their own distinct tones and approaches. This series took a rather serious tone throughout its run, with the exception of the final entry, the Abbott and Costello version. These movies are included in the Universal Classic Monsters continuity, along with other movies from that era, like the 1925's Phantom of the Opera, 1931's Dracula, and 1933's The Invisible Man. The Universal Monster series continues to be in production today, albeit with significant fewer productions and with a new continuity. Some similarities I'd like to point out now is that, unlike later iterations, the original series primarily seems to be focused on more of a grounded threat. Throughout these first 6 movies, the Mummy wasn't a world-ending force, but rather a vengeful spirit or a tool for malevolent individuals. And certain abilities, such as the invulnerability to bullets, enhanced strength, and the ability to rise from the dead, consistently appeared across these films. The series often intertwined with the world of archaeology, featuring characters driven by the passion for discovery and sometimes the resulting unintended consequences. And some differences that I would like to draw attention to is that the series ranged from the serious and atmospheric vibes of the early films to the more comedic at the very end with the Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. The 1932 film uniquely depicts the mummy briefly returning to human form, while subsequent entries kept the creature in its wrapped state. And the early films hinted at the existence of Egyptian gods and the possibility of divine intervention. As the series progresses, it's interesting to note the stylistic changes in the cinematography, which I'll be pointing to later as we progress through each of these individual movies. In the original 1932 The Mummy, we are introduced to an archaeological expedition led by Sir Joseph Wimple, who unearths the mummy of Imhotep, an ancient Egyptian high priest, and when the team accidentally reads from the Scroll of Thoth, Imhotep is resurrected. 10 years later, Imhotep, now masquerading as Ardaf Bey, an eccentric Egyptian historian, guides a new expedition to the tomb of Princess Ankh-es-Amon. He becomes obsessed with Helen Grosvenor, a woman who bears a striking resemblance to the princess, and believing her to be her reincarnation. Imhotep attempts to make Helen his immortal bride, but his plans are thwarted by the intervention of Helen herself, who, through a connection to her past life, invokes the power of the goddess Isis. The Scroll of Thoth is destroyed, and Imhotep crumbles to dust. The seminal film introduced Boris Karloff's iconic portrayal of Imhotep, a high priest resurrected after his tomb is destroyed, and a significant departure from the later films in this continuity. Imhotep briefly reverts to human form, though his movements remain stiff and unnatural. The film explores themes of forbidden love and vengeful spirits, with Imhotep seeking the reincarnation of his lost lover, Ankh-es-Amon. Notably, this version features unique abilities like scrying and a force-like choke power that we don't quite see in the rest of the iterations of The Mummy. I thought this was an incredible first entry to the movie, and I thought that its abandonment in the subsequent films was both disappointing and disadvantageous to the community it would have built with this original portrayal. In the 1940 The Mummy's Hand, this entry shifts the focus away from Imhotep, and a new mummy, Charis, is resurrected by a cult seeking to use him for their own purposes. Both Charis and the original Imhotep have nearly identical origins, going so far as to even reuse footage from the 1932 movie. The second movie in the series, while relying on similar origins, is considered neither a sequel nor a remake, which was rather confusing as a viewer. Karis is bound to the service of the cult, highlighting the manipulative nature of evil, and the film retains the series' focus on a grounded horror, with the mummy posing a more physical threat. From this movie through the 1944's The Mummy's Curse, the control over the mummy and the manipulation of its actions are done through drip feeding it a tea brewed from the tana leaves. These leaves are what keeps the mummy alive just enough, while a larger dose are what gives Karis greater life and enables him to carry out the priest's orders, albeit only temporarily. Not only has the cinematography changed with the new director and approach to the horror of the mummy, but the script is noticeably different. It feels like this movie was more for the public, as its script seemed to utilize middle diction rather than the slightly more elevated language used in the previous film. I found this movie to be much more approachable and easier to watch and enjoy, and it felt a little less highbrow. Now in The Mummy's Tomb from 1942, we follow the archaeologist Steve Banning years after his encounter with the mummy Karis, depicted in the previous film, The Mummy's Hand. The film begins with a lengthy 12.5-minute recap of the events of The Mummy's Hand, a practice that would be likely considered excessive by today's audiences. Despite this, the film effectively establishes the continuation of the story. Karis and his high priest Andoheb are revealed to have survived their previous encounter. Andoheb, seeking revenge on the Bannings, sends Karis to the United States to carry out his vengeance. Karis embarks on a killing spree, targeting the Banning family. Babe Hansen, a returning character from the previous movie, suspects the mummy is responsible, but his claims are initially dismissed. However, evidence gradually emerges to support his theory, including a grayish mark found in his victims' throats, which is a unique identifier used in these mummies movies. This grayish mark found on the victims' necks is actually mold, and this mold is used throughout the series to identify the victims as victims of the mummy. The film employs several classic horror tropes. Victims often cower in fear instead of fleeing, displaying poor survival instincts. Police officers are initially skeptical of any claim, and a classic pitchfork and torch mob makes its own appearance. The trope of the villain seeking to possess the love interest of their enemy is also present, as Adinoweb's successor, Mehmet Bey, kidnaps Isabel, a character engaged to Steve Banning's son. Interestingly, while Karis initially appears to be merely a weapon under the control of the priests, he demonstrates a degree of agency by the end, seemingly resisting Mehmet Bey's attempt to claim Isabel for himself. The film effectively builds suspense through dialogue with lines like, "All will die before the end," adding to the atmosphere of dread. The use of newspaper articles helped to establish the local community's growing awareness of the supernatural events unfolding, and reminds me of old 80s and 90s cartoons. Ultimately, a confrontation ensues at the Banning estate, culminating in Karis being consumed by fire. The film concludes with the unceremonious demise of Mehmet Bey, which highlights the fragility of those who wield power over monsters. In The Mummy's Ghost, 1944, it opens with a significant shorter recap, at 4.5 minutes compared to its predecessor, The Mummy's Tomb. This entry features a more active and emotive Karis, displaying emotions like rage and desire, which is a departure from the previous portrayals. The sheriff, retaining his role from the previous film, immediately recognizes the mummy as the culprit, which demonstrates a degree of continuity and competence. The film introduces Amina, a reincarnation of Princess Ananka. Unbeknownst to her, Amina experiences a strange connection to the ancient past, including a prophetic dream and a growing psychic link to Karis, which is visually represented by the appearance of gray hair, which becomes increasingly prevalent throughout the movie. The psychic connection inadvertently draws Karis to her. The story revolves around Yusuf Bey, the new high priest who is tasked with retrieving Karis. Yusuf Bey performs a ritual to summon Karis, which further strengthens his connection with Amina. Karis awakens and embarks on a killing spree, targeting individuals connected to the ritual. Yusuf Bey arrives in Mapleton and continues the ritual, further inciting Karis' rampage. Yusuf Bey soon seeks to find the reincarnation of Ananka, ultimately leading him to Amina. Karis, drawn to Amina's presence, kidnaps her. However, Yusuf Bey, initially seeking to fulfill his duty, becomes obsessed with Amina and desires to keep her alive for himself. This angers Karis, leading to a confrontation. The film also features several odd cinematic choices, such as a disembodied voice which speaks once and without further explanation. Scenes clearly filmed during daytime but meant to depict the night were filmed with lanterns, creating an ambiguous sense of time and allowing for shots where the mummy is visible to the audience but not to the characters. Despite these quirks, the film continues to explore themes of reincarnation, obsession, and the dangers of meddling with ancient forces. The male lead, Amina's boyfriend, proves to be a frustrating character, making it difficult to root for him. Ultimately, I was rooting against him by the end. I at least appreciate that in this movie, the sheriff is the same person and immediately recognizes the mummy as a villain behind the murders. Disappointed that this film had the least empowered female lead yet, it felt like this was the only way that they could justify her character meeting the fate she encountered by the end of the movie, which was to be dragged into the swamp by Karis to become a mummy herself. And now we come to the final serious incarnation of the mummy in this original series, The Mummy's Curse from 1944. The film revolves around a swamp rumored to be haunted by the mummy Karis and his bride, Ananka. Southern Engineering Company's attempt to drain the swamp is disrupted by superstitious workers. Dr. James Halsey and Dr. Ilzor Zandab from the Scripps Museum arrive to locate the mummies buried there. However, Zandab is currently a high priest for the Arkham sect, working with his disciple Rakib to revive Karis and continue their sinister rituals. During the excavation, Ananka is resurrected and transforms back into a young woman, however with amnesia and an uncanny knowledge of ancient Egypt. Locals discover her, but she is relentlessly pursued by Karis. Amid the chaos, Karis kills several people, including those who try to help Ananka, and he seeks to reclaim his bride. The story takes a turn when Rakib betrays Zandab by making advances on Betty Walsh, the niece of the project's head. After Rakib kills Zandab, Karis turns on him, causing the monastery in which this action takes place to collapse, killing both Rakib and Karis. Halsey and Betty survive, discovering Ananka's mummified remains and concluding the tragic tale. The movie opens differently than expected, beginning with a show rather than a recap of prior films, though a recap is still included shortly afterward. Unlike the previous installment, many scenes are shot at night, creating a more atmospheric and genuine horror tone. One of the standout moments is when Ananka rises from the swamp, which is a chilling development that marks the turning point in the story. However, the excitement wanes as she is oddly transformed into a human rather than remaining a mummy. This felt like a missed opportunity, as her joining forces with Karis could have made for a compelling tag team horror narrative. Karis once again meets an ambiguous fate, leaving room for speculation about whether he has truly been defeated. Unfortunately, the film ends with the trope of the hero suddenly getting the girl, despite the lack of any meaningful romantic build-up. Despite its flaws, The Mummy's Curse is a solid addition to the series, offering strong storytelling and surprising developments. It improves on its predecessor, though it underutilizes Princess Ananka's reincarnation arc, which could have been explored further. And finally, we arrive at the final installation, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy from 1955. In Cairo, Abbott and Costello overhear a conversation about the mummy Claris, notably different than Karis, and a medallion that reveals the location of Princess Ara's treasure. Hoping to profit from this discovery, they inadvertently become entangled in a series of misadventures involving Madame Rontru, a greedy treasure hunter, and Simu, the leader of Claris's followers. Through a series of comedic blunders, including accidentally eating the cursed medallion, the duo finds themselves joining Rontru and Simu on an expedition to the tomb. However, Simu betrays the group, leading to a chaotic chase inside the tomb. The madness culminates when Rontru uses dynamite, which destroys Claris and uncovers the treasure. And in the end, Abbott and Costello convince Simu to transform the tomb into a nightclub, preserving the legend of Claris while ensuring ongoing entertainment for themselves. The movie is a very clear departure from the traditional mummy storyline, using it instead as a backdrop for Abbott and Costello's slapstick comedy. The humor is highly cartoonish, filled with physical gags, exaggerated clumsiness, and direct camera looks. Rather than weaving comedy into the story, it feels like the mummy plot is merely a setup for their routines. While this style of humor doesn't resonate with me, it's easy to see how it appealed to an older generation of comedy enthusiasts. Indeed, it was a different era of comedy. The return to an Egyptian setting is a refreshing change, as this is the first installment since the very first movie to predominantly take place in Egypt. The femme fatale treasure hunter, Madame Rontru, is a standout character who brings intrigue to the plot. Unfortunately, I feel that her potential feels wasted on this film. She would have been more compelling in a serious mummy movie. Overall, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy is a unique entry in the franchise, blending slapstick comedy with classic mummy tropes. Though not everyone will enjoy its humor, it remains an entertaining relic of its time. This has been my review of the original series for The Mummy. While each movie introduced its own unique twist on the mummy and the way the world reacts to it, I find this original series to be very entertaining, and I wouldn't be surprised if I chose to go back and watch these movies again. Boris Karloff's mummy was certainly iconic, while the subsequent Karras mummy is actually monumental in itself. In fact, it seems that as I look around on the internet, most people attribute to the cliche of a shambling mummy to Karras, which appeared from The Mummy's Hand, The Tomb, Ghost, and Curse from 1940 to 1944. It's impossible to deny the effect that these movies have clearly had on representation of mummies in media. I've also found numerous aspects of these movies themselves have been reincarnated in future iterations of The Mummy. And in fact, I look forward to getting to the Sommer series from the 90s to discuss how some of these characteristics and plot points are actually reused. Thank you for joining me on this first look at the Mummy franchise. And if you've happened to watch, or you decide to watch these original movies, I hope you let me know what you thought of them.